You join me for a fairly sedate shelf isolation video today. As you can see, lockdown's been going on for quite some time. I've got the lockdown hair atop of my head, but I thought today might be a nice time to do a second shelf isolation video. So a text that you could do for coursework, a text that you might just want to read to prepare you for university, a text that might allow you to start getting some ideas together for at least genres that you might do for your coursework for next year if you are in first year. So as you can see, the bookcase is behind me. I'm going to try things a little bit differently today. I'm just going to reach behind me, just totally at random, see what book I pull out, because I like to do these things completely spontaneously and off the top of my head, and just chat in a freestyling way about the book that I happen to pick out. So, see, not looking at all. Let's just see what book comes out. So I've got one here. Oh, Butterfingers. I'll just go and pick it up. And as you can see, completely spontaneously, the book that I happen to have picked out it's Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And I notice also on the floor was a little scrap of paper, an old envelope that just happened to be there. So I'll just keep that in my hand as well, so I can throw it in the bin when I get out of the room. By while talking, completely spontaneously, remember off the top of my head about Frankenstein. So, why do I think that Frankenstein is a really used book to do for coursework? I think partly context AO3 is fantastic for this text. You do need for context to try and avoid quite generalised comments. So, life was tough for women back then, or, at the time many people couldn't read. You want to get into really specific facts about the author's life that influenced the text. You want to get into specific contextual facts in terms of the era. Frankenstein is absolutely full of that. So it's written by Mary Shelley, who is the daughter, and you can look into more information on these people, of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. Both of them fairly famous figures at the time. Both kind of what we maybe now would call quite socialist, very sort of pro workers' rights. Mary Wollstonecraft was a real kind of early feminist, so that would allow you a real nice angle to come into. You've got really nice specific contextual factors to look at. Mary Shelley herself, bit of a feminist as well. She's called Mary Shelley because she married Percy Shelley, who's a romantic poet. And the way the text came about was really fascinating. So Shelley and Byron essentially got exiled. Byron was another romantic poet like Percy Shelley, both very unpopular in England, or very controversial in England. Shelley partly because he was an atheist. So they went off for this sort of tour of Italy, and while there challenged each other to write ghost stories. And it was actually Mary Shelley, Percy's wife, who came up with Frankenstein. It is on the face of it a horror text, but it's also full of kind of key romantic ideas. So the romantics very much kicked back against the 100 years that had happened before, the years of the Age of Enlightenment, in which science was seen as the way forward. Mary Shelley basically in this text shows why actually science is a bit of an issue and why the natural world maybe should be left as it is. There's also an interesting point where Percy Shelley was an atheist. Well, Frankenstein deals with those sorts of themes. Frankenstein himself essentially plays God, and we could argue how far does Mary Shelley make a case for or against God existing in this text. Obviously, the role of women is one that's fascinating to talk about in this text as well, partly because of Mary Shelley's background, but also partly because Frankenstein is essentially the father who gives birth to this male heir who he disowns. Women don't have a very big role in this text, so an awful lot of stuff that you could look at here and kind of focus on and draw in for the contextual background of this text. In terms of themes, what might your question be about? Women, I think, would come up very well. So you could put it with, The Handmaid's Tale, The Bloody Chamber, but any text, a Shakespeare text, any text in which you might want to talk about women. I think bodies would be good, in which case you could put it with a dystopian text. You could put it with something like Never Let Me Go, again, or The Handmaid's Tale, or 1984, that often look at the human body in a dystopia. Frankenstein isn't dystopian in the same way, but it's very much about the human body. Frankenstein has literally created this creature by putting different bits of bodies together, and that's the source of real disgust for him. The human body itself is a source of disgust for Frankenstein, because he seems to spend the novel essentially trying to avoid his wedding night. He seems terrified of kind of sex with women, and one reading is that creating this creature is his way of trying to create new life without needing to sort of do that. Humanity and outsiders, what makes us human? This is a text that really deals with that. A key concept you might talk about if you were doing Frankenstein is the idea of the liminal. What that means is things that are on the threshold between right and wrong, between what's civilised and what's uncivilised. This text deals with that completely. Is the creature ever civilised? Is he always determined by the fact that this is a horrific thing? Can he ever be civilised? Has Frankenstein transgressed? Has Frankenstein crossed that threshold and done something unforgivable? Will he always be punished? Is his death inevitable? It very much deals with the liminal. Any text about outsiders, Wuthering Heights would be a very interesting one. Similar time, Heathcliff and Frankenstein's creation. How far are they similar? How far are they not? And then in terms of, the AO2, in terms of analysing these texts, whatever you put it with, a really surefire way of making sure that you're covering enough sort of AO2, enough techniques, is to think of the acronym FSN-LIP. A good way of remembering it is, for students, no lesson is perfect. There's 6 things there, okay? FSN-LIP. F, form, S, structure, N, narrative, voice and perspective, L, language, I, imagery, P, place and setting. If you talk about those 6 areas, you know that you're really looking with evidence. You know that you're looking at all the various things that these authors do, and for AO2, that's what you need to put in there. So in terms of form, well, what could you say about Frankenstein? Well, it's an epistolary novel. In other words, it's written through letters. It's quite common at the time. Mary Shelley essentially takes her own voice out of this and tells it through a series of narrators. Think about, well, why is that? Ultimately, actually, this whole story is written to someone we never meet, to the sister of Walton, this sailor. Why does Mary Shelley have the whole text essentially being read by a woman? What could you say there about feminism? Structure, well, what we say here, and another reason Frankenstein would be great to put with Wuthering Heights, they both have a Russian doll narrative structure. In other words, they have stories within stories within stories. So in Wuthering Heights, Lockwood tells a story, and then in the middle of it, Nellie Dean tells him a story that he has passed on to us. Within Nellie Dean's story, there are sections where Cathy or Heathcliff tell their version of the story. Frankenstein's similar. Okay, at the start and end, we have Walton, this sailor, who's writing to his sister about this voyage he's been on. While on the voyage, he meets Frankenstein, very much at the end of his life, who tells his story of how he got there. Within Frankenstein's story, the creature explains what he did, so we get stories within stories. It's a Russian doll. One way you could see that is essentially Mary Shelley is going into the body and then going out of the body, looking at what is it that makes us human. Another way of looking at it, she's put the creature's voice right at the middle. This whole thing rotates around that. Why might that have been? Another point you could make about that, very interestingly, is that right in the middle of the creature story, he reads Paradise Lost, an epic poem by John Milton. It's nice for context. It's a poem that deals with essentially morality and right and wrong, and how far God or Satan are sympathetic characters. That's really at the middle of this story. Why has Mary Shelley done that? There's an awful lot of ways we could sort of go with the structure, but I'd definitely sort of talk about why that's in there. In terms of narrative voice, obviously, as I've said, you've got all these sort of different speakers. The creature is speaking right at the heart. You've got the fact that this is written ultimately for a female reader. Why has Mary Shelley done that? Interestingly, in terms of narrative voice, right at the end of the text where it goes back to Walton narrating, Frankenstein speaks just before he dies, and he tells Walton's men, basically they go up on this expedition to see how far they can go into the polar regions, and Frankenstein speaks to the men and says, keep going, they're stuck in ice. He says, keep going. The men ignore him, but Walton basically goes, no, actually, he's wrong. So after Frankenstein dies, Walton changes his mind. So what we get in terms of narrative voice is ultimately Walton doesn't make the same mistakes as Frankenstein. Frankenstein pushed, and that could be seen as a bit of a metaphor for the Age of Enlightenment, people trying to learn more and more and more. Walton decides not to. Again, in terms of the moral of the text, we could look at that. Why does Shelley put Walton's voice right at the end? How is his voice and his decision different to Frankenstein's? You also get this idea that throughout his part of the story, Frankenstein is a very unreliable narrator. there are descriptions where it is almost as though Frankenstein is going back and changing the story as it comes in, almost like he's adding these gothic features, the moon or the sun or the howling when he first sees the creature. He describes his horror at it and essentially says that he passed out. Again, you can look at the role of that narrative voice and why Mary Shelley puts that in there, such an unreliable narrator. In terms of language and imagery, there's a lot of times you could look at the language. Frankenstein's slightly hyperbolic style of speech versus the creature's far more rational style of speech. Why does Mary Shelley link those two together or contrast them? I think bodies and sex are fascinating. Anytime bodies are described is great. There's a bit fairly early on where Frankenstein has a dream that he's going to kiss his fiancée, and then in this dream she turns into his mother's corpse. There's an awful lot of ideas there about Frankenstein's fear of women, but also the idea of Frankenstein's love being linked to death. Frankenstein's thought of marriage and therefore sex being linked to death. He creates life, not through having sex, but through putting all these dead bodies together. So you get that. The sun and the moon, you could Google sun and moon in Frankenstein, it's fascinating. In the creatures part of the narrative, the sun is often described. In Frankenstein's, the moon is often described. If you look at those moments, why is that? Is Mary Shelley suggesting that essentially Frankenstein is haunted by the moon of what he's done? The creature is desperate for the sun, in other words, him to be kind of accepted and seen that way. The whole creature's text is his search for acceptance from Frankenstein and therefore from, I guess, the reader, from God. And then place and setting is fascinating. You've got the ship, okay, at the start and end. This symbol of, I guess, the Age of Enlightenment trying to go further and push further and learn more and know more. So it starts and ends on the ship, but the ship is stuck, representing, I guess, man's inability to really get beyond their own boundaries. Right in the middle of the text, you have in the creature story, you have the De Lacy's cottage. He goes to see these people who seem to represent the ideal of romantic life. They're poor, they're in a small cottage in the middle of the woods, they're at one with nature, they're this ideal family unit who love each other very much. When the creature tries to make contact, though, it's clear that their idyllic way of life is only kept that way by keeping other people out. He can never cross their threshold. He's not accepted by that family. So structurally, that's very interesting in terms of where the settings are. But Shelley's also making a point about society versus kind of the great unknown at either end, the ship in there. And a final point is kind of a contextual one, but it ties these things in together. There's actually two versions of Frankenstein. Mary Shelley wrote the first version or published the first version in 1818. She then revised it in, I believe it was 1834, but I would need to check that. So there's actually two versions of Frankenstein. It's worth looking at both. If you get a standard version, often that will be based on the later version. But if you check, I'm sure it will tell you on the book itself, or if you Google which edition you've got, it will tell you which one it's based on. Find out about the differences. The general consensus is that Mary Shelley was a bit angry in 1818. She was younger, she was a bit more controversial. So in that we have Frankenstein wanting to get married to his own cousin. There's a suggestion of incest. There's a suggestion of essentially blaming the upper classes for what's happened. It's a slightly more radical text that essentially blames the bourgeois, the middle class, and suggests that the proletariat, represented by the creature, might one day rise up. It's an angry, like I say, quite aggressively socialist text. The 1834 version, Elizabeth, Frankenstein's fiancée, becomes an adopted child into the family. She's not a blood relation. That has been toned down. There's other moments that get toned down in a similar way. So contextually, that would be great, looking at the two versions, comparing the language, seeing what's going on. So Frankenstein, I'm glad that came up totally by random off the top of my head, because actually I felt I could say a lot of things that mean it would be very good for your coursework.